The dust bit into exposed skin like crushed glass, but the woman on the ridge did not blink. At 4 feet 9 inches, Specialist Hallie Thorne was almost swallowed by the oversized ghillie suit that broke her silhouette against the limestone. The wind howled across Hill 3050 with the voice of something ancient and hungry, threatening to peel her off the mountain face. 3,050 meters below, 7 heat signatures glowed white against the cooling rocks through her thermal scope. Her men, pinned down, dying. Hallie's gloved hand moved with microscopic precision, dialing the elevation turret of the Chi-Tak M200 intervention rifle. The clicks reverberated through her fingertips like a heartbeat. Through the scope, 9 enemy fighters were setting up a mortar tube on the opposite ridge. 30 seconds until the first round dropped. 30 seconds until Viper Team became a memory and a flag-draped coffin. Adjust elevation, 3,050 meters, she whispered to the storm. Her voice was devoid of the tremor shaking the ground beneath her. Wind is howling. It's a suicide shot. But suicide was relative. Staying silent was certain death for the men below. They had called her a doll. By sunrise, she would save all their lives, or die trying. The story began 48 hours earlier, when the sun over Forward Operating Base Sentinel was not just a temperature, but a physical weight that demanded submission. The C-130 Hercules transport plane touched down on the shimmering tarmac with a screech of rubber and the acrid smell of burnt brake pads. The rear ramp lowered with hydraulic precision, and the heat rolled in like a living thing, thick and oppressive. It smelled of jet fuel, ancient baked earth, and the particular staleness of a war that had gone on too long. Hallie Thorne stepped to the edge of the ramp and looked down. The drop to the tarmac was perhaps 3 feet. For most soldiers, it was a simple step. For her, it was a reminder of every obstacle she had ever faced. She hopped down. Her boots hit the concrete with a solid thud that felt more definitive than the impact warranted. The duffel bag slung across her shoulder weighed nearly 60 pounds, dragging her center of gravity to the left, but her spine remained ramrod straight. She adjusted the strap with gloved hands, her expression hidden behind polarized ballistic sunglasses that reflected the white, hot sky. At 4 feet 9 inches and 108 pounds, Hallie was an anomaly in this world of towering shoulders and bearded jawlines. The Chi-Tak M200 intervention rifle case strapped to her back was nearly as tall as she was. The weight of the system, including optics, bipod, and specialized ammunition, approached 35 pounds. Add the body armor, water, and survival gear, and she was carrying close to 70% of her body weight. She had carried heavier. She had endured worse. A voice drifted from the shade of a nearby hangar, low but carrying clearly in the stagnant air. "Hey, check it out. Did someone order a mascot?" Laughter followed. Short, sharp, masculine barks of amusement that echoed across the flight line. Hallie did not turn. She had heard the jokes in boot camp, in sniper school, and at every deployment briefing since she earned her tab. The jokes were as predictable as the sunrise. So was her response. She kept walking. The group of men lounging on equipment crates were massive, engineered by genetics and years of lifting heavy iron. Their arms were covered in tattoos that told stories of previous deployments, failed relationships, and misplaced loyalty. Their faces were masked by tactical beards and the particular brand of indifference that came from seeing too much death too young. They wore tan t-shirts with the sleeves cut off and carried themselves with the easy confidence of apex predators. SEAL Team Viper, Tier 1 operators, the best of the best, or so they believed. Hallie stopped in front of the man who seemed to be the center of gravity for the group. He was huge, easily 6'4", with shoulders that seemed engineered to kick down doors. His eyes were the color of slate, cold and evaluating. A faded scar ran from his left eyebrow to his cheekbone, the kind of mark that came from shrapnel or broken glass in close-quarters combat. "Excuse me," Hallie said. Her voice was calm, professional, stripped of any inflection that might be mistaken for deference or challenge. "Captain Blackwood?" The big man looked down. He had to tilt his head significantly to make eye contact. A smirk played on his lips, not of malice exactly, but of genuine disbelief, as if someone had just told him the sun rose in the west and expected him to accept it as fact. "Are you lost, sweetheart?" His voice was gravel wrapped in leather, worn smooth by years of shouting orders over gunfire. "The humanitarian aid tent is on the other side of the airfield. I think they're looking for volunteers to hand out stuffed animals to local kids." Hallie reached into her chest rig and produced a manila folder, sealed with red tape. She extended it without comment. "Specialist Hallie Thorne, attached scout sniper for Operation Viper Strike. Orders from JSOC." The silence that followed was heavy enough to have physical weight. The other SEALs stopped cleaning their weapons. One man, a mountain of muscle with a shaved head and a neck as thick as Hallie's thigh, paused mid-sip from his water bottle. Another, younger with the kind of jawline that belonged on a recruiting poster, actually laughed out loud. Captain Garrett Blackwood took the folder. He flipped through the pages with agonizing slowness, as if reading a menu he intended to reject. His eyes scanned from her dusty boots to the top of her helmet, which sat slightly too large on her head, despite the adjustment straps being cinched to their tightest setting. "You're the sniper," Blackwood said. It was not a question, it was an accusation. "Yes, sir." "Command said they were sending support, not a—" He paused, searching for a word that would not technically violate regulations regarding conduct, but would still sting. "A doll." The word hung in the air like smoke. The younger SEAL with the jawline snorted into his water bottle. "That's it. We got ourselves a tactical doll." Hallie's expression did not change. She had been called worse by better men. "My qualification scores are in the file, sir. Sniper school graduate, top 15% of class. 4 confirmed kills on previous deployment. Longest successful engagement at 1,900 meters in Helmand Province. I am certified on the M110, M2010, and ShyTac M200 intervention platforms. I don't care about scores on a paper target, Thorne." Blackwood handed the file back, letting it drop slightly so she had to snatch it from the air. "We hump 80-pound rucksacks 20 kilometers into bad country. If you lag behind, we don't carry you. We leave you. That's the rule. You are a logistical liability before we even step off the wire." "I can carry my own weight, sir." "Your weight isn't the problem." Blackwood leaned in, his shadow completely engulfing her. The temperature difference was measurable. "It's the weight of the mission. People die when we slow down. People die when we get pinned down because someone can't keep pace. People die because someone thought it would be good for morale or publicity or whatever political bullshit put you on my manifest." Hallie looked up at him. The reflection in her sunglasses showed his face, distorted and enormous. "I don't slow down, sir." "We'll see about that." Blackwood straightened to his full height. "Go find a bunk in the overflow tent. Briefing is at 1900 hours. Try not to get lost on the way." He turned his back on her, signaling that the conversation was over. The team resumed their banter, the air of dismissal absolute. To them, she had already ceased to exist as anything more than a checkbox on a diversity initiative form. Hallie stood there for a moment. The heat radiating off the tarmac burned through the soles of her boots. She looked at the captain's broad back, at the way his team orbited him like moons around a planet. She felt the familiar burn of humiliation in her chest, hot and acidic. But she pushed it down into the cold, dark place where she kept everything that might make her hesitate. She gripped the strap of her duffel bag tighter. Her knuckles turned white beneath the gloves. "Copy that, sir," she whispered to no one but the wind. She turned and walked toward the barracks, her jaw set, her purpose clear. The Tactical Operations Center was a bubble of refrigerated air and artificial light, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat waiting just outside the canvas walls. Inside, the hum of a diesel generator provided a low, constant drone that vibrated against the ribcage. Dust motes hung suspended in the beams of light cutting through the gloom, and the air smelled of stale coffee, sweat, and the particular brand of tension that preceded violence. In the center of the tent, a large whiteboard displayed a projected three-dimensional topographic map. The terrain was a jagged scar of limestone canyons and knife-edge ridges known locally as the Devil's Throat. It was a place where the earth itself seemed hostile to human life, where the rocks radiated heat like coals, and the wind carried sand sharp enough to strip paint. Hallie stood in the shadows near the entrance, arms crossed over her chest. She had shed the oversized helmet, revealing short-cropped hair that did nothing to soften the sharp angles of her face. Her eyes moved constantly, reading the terrain, calculating fields of fire, identifying choke points in kill zones. This was her language. This was where she spoke fluently. Captain Garrett Blackwood dominated the room. He moved with the restless energy of a caged predator, a black marker pen squeaking sharply against the whiteboard as he drew red lines through the projected terrain. Alpha insertion here. He tapped a flat plateau on the map. We foot patrol 3 clicks south under cover of darkness. Enter the canyon floor at 0200 hours. Target compound is nestled against the eastern wall. Here. Rapid entry. Secure the HVT. Extract to the LZ before sunrise. The other 6 members of Viper team nodded in unison. To them, it was standard operating procedure. A simple grab and go. They had done it 100 times before in 100 different valleys. The confidence in the room was palpable, the kind that came from surviving when others did not. Hallie's eyes narrowed as she studied the contour lines on the map. The elevation gradients were steep, creating a natural amphitheater around the proposed route. The canyon walls rose like the sides of a bowl, offering perfect, unfilleted fire positions for anyone holding the high ground. To walk into that space was to put your head in a noose and hope no one pulled the rope. "Sir," Hallie's voice cut through the drone of the generator. It was not loud, but it had a frequency that demanded attention. Blackwood paused, the marker hovering over the board. He turned slowly, an expression of mild annoyance tightening his jaw. "Questions, Thorne?" The route through the canyon floor. Hallie stepped out of the shadows. She walked toward the map, her small stature making the seals around the table look like giants. "It's a kill box. The canyon walls offer perfect overlapping fields of fire for anyone sitting on the ridges. If you get pinned down there, you have no cover and no concealment. It's a tactical dead end." "We operate under darkness, Thorne." Blackwood dismissed her with a wave of the marker. "We have thermal superiority, night vision. Besides, Reaper drones are on station for close air support if things get loud. The meteorological report indicates a high probability of a haboo forming in the next 12 hours. Hallie persisted. She reached for the laser pointer on the table, but a large hand covered it before her fingers made contact. Kruger, the team's heavy weapons specialist. He did not look at her. He just leaned his considerable weight on the table, blocking her access. Hallie withdrew her hand slowly. "If the Sandstorm hits, air support is grounded. Your thermal superiority vanishes. You'll be blind in a valley while the enemy holds the high ground." "You worry too much, doll," Kruger grunted. A smirk hid somewhere in his beard. "We've been doing this since you were playing with actual dolls." "I'm analyzing the risk," Hallie corrected. Her voice hardened, just a fraction. "There's an overwatch position here." She pointed with her finger toward a jagged peak, marked at elevation 3050 on the map, far above the canyon floor. "If I insert early and climb to this ridge, I can cover your advance even if the weather turns. It gives me a clean line of sight into the compound and the surrounding cliffs." Blackwood sighed. It was the sound of a man whose patience had been tested past its limit. He dropped the marker onto the tray with a clatter and walked over to Hallie, looming over her until she had to crane her neck to look him in the eye. "Let's get one thing very clear, Specialist." His voice was low and dangerous, the kind of tone that preceded violence. "This is a direct action raid, speed and violence of action. I do not need a support sniper wandering off on a solo hiking trip 3 kilometers away from the team. If you get compromised up there, I am not sending my men to fetch you. Do you understand me?" "I'm not asking you to fetch me, sir. I'm offering to clear the path." "Your job," Blackwood interrupted, poking a finger toward her chest, but stopping an inch away, "is to trail the formation, watch our six, and stay out of the way. If we need a long gun, we'll ask for it. Until then, you are luggage. Do you copy?" The tent went silent. The disrespect was palpable, thick enough to taste. The other SEALs watched with the detached interest of men watching someone else's humiliation. Hallie looked at the map one last time, at the ridge line that offered salvation, and then at the men who were too arrogant to see the trap closing around them. She stepped forward, desperate to point at the crucial choke point one last time, to make them see the geometry of the ambush waiting to unfold. But Kruger shifted his massive torso, completely blocking her view of the map, effectively walling her off from the planning circle. "Excuse me," Kruger said. He did not move an inch. Hallie realized then that it was not about tactics. It was about hierarchy. To them, she was not a soldier. She was a quota, a checkbox, a liability wrapped in Kevlar and good intentions. She stepped back, retreating into the cold, professional detachment that had kept her sane through 4 years of this. She let the mask settle over her features, smooth and impenetrable. "Copy that, sir," Hallie said. Her voice was empty of emotion. "Trail and observe." Blackwood nodded, satisfied that order had been restored. "Good. Wheels up at 0400. Get your gear squared away." Hallie turned and walked out of the tent into the suffocating night. The wind was picking up, hot and dry, carrying the first gritty taste of sand. The sky to the west was no longer clear. It was a bruised, ugly color that did not belong in nature. They were walking into a trap, and she was the only one who could hear the cage door creaking shut. The night before a mission was always the same. The base settled into a tense quiet, broken only by the distant hum of generators and the occasional bark of a guard dog. Most soldiers tried to sleep, knowing that rest was a weapon just as valuable as ammunition. Others wrote letters they would never send, or stared at photographs of people whose faces were becoming harder to remember with each deployment. Hallie sat alone in the corner of the equipment bay, a space that smelled of gun oil, canvas, and the particular musk of old sweat baked into nylon. A single work light hung above her position, casting harsh shadows that made the room feel smaller than it was. The Shytac M200 intervention lay disassembled on a rubber mat in front of her. Each component gleamed under the light, meticulously cleaned and inspected. The barrel was a work of art, precision machined to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The bolt was smooth, worn in by thousands of repetitions until it moved like water. The stock was carbon fiber, light and strong, scarred by use but still functional. Hallie's hands moved with the unconscious grace of ritual. She ran a bore snake through the barrel, checking for any carbon buildup that might affect accuracy. She inspected the crown, where the rifling ended, looking for any damage that might destabilize the projectile. She checked the torque on the scope mounting screws with a small wrench, ensuring they were tight but not over-tightened. This rifle was not just a tool. It was an extension of her will. It was the equalizer that made her size irrelevant. Through this scope, at distance, she was 10 feet tall and bulletproof. She began loading magazines. The ammunition was specialized, hand-loaded to exacting specifications. 408 Chi-Tac rounds, each one a miniature work of engineering. The solid copper projectiles were laid-turned, perfectly balanced, designed to remain stable at distances where most bullets tumbled into uselessness. She had 5 magazines, 7 rounds each, 35 chances to make a difference. The last 3 rounds in her kit were different. Silver-tipped, armor-piercing incendiary rounds, API, designed to punch through hardened steel and ignite fuel vapors inside. She hoped she would not need them. Hope was a luxury, but she indulged in it occasionally. From her chest rig, she pulled out a small, weatherproof notepad and a mechanical pencil. She flipped to a clean page and began to sketch the terrain from memory. The Devil's Throat Canyon, the ridge lines, the elevation changes. She marked potential hide sites, likely enemy positions, fields of fire, dead zones. If they would not listen to her in the briefing, she would be ready anyway. She pulled out her Kestrel weather meter, a small electronic device that measured wind speed, temperature, barometric pressure, and humidity. She turned it on, watching the numbers stabilize. Currently, the wind was gusting to 20 knots from the west. Barometric pressure was dropping steadily. Temperature inversion was likely as the desert cooled. The haboo was coming. The meteorological models were clear. Within 12 hours, a wall of dust 3,000 feet high would sweep across this region with the inevitability of a tide. Visibility would drop to near zero. Communications would fail as ionization from the storm scattered radio waves. Aircraft would be grounded, and Viper team would be alone in a valley with no cover. Hallie closed her eyes and ran through the calculations in her head. If she could get to Hill 3050, the elevation would put her above the worst of the storm. Thermal optics could cut through the particulate matter, reading the infrared radiation of warm bodies against cooler rocks. She would be able to see what no one else could see. She would be their eyes, their guardian angel, whether they wanted one or not. A sound at the entrance made her look up. Brennan, the team medic, stood in the doorway. He was younger than the others, maybe 29, with a kind of lean build that came from running marathons for fun. His hands were never still, always fidgeting with medical tape or checking the contents of his aid bag. "Can't sleep either?" Brennan asked. "Sleep is for people who trust the plan," Hallie replied. Brennan walked over and sat down on an equipment crate, keeping a respectful distance. He watched her hands moving over the rifle components with the fascination of someone watching a craftsman at work. "You really think the captain's wrong about the route?" he asked quietly. "I think the captain is operating on incomplete information and confirmation bias," Hallie said. "He's done 100 successful raids, so he thinks this one will be the same. But terrain dictates tactics, not tradition. You could be wrong too." "I could be," Hallie nodded. "But if I'm wrong, you all walk out safely, and I wasted a climb. If he's wrong, you all die in a canyon, and I have to live with not trying hard enough to stop it." Brennan was quiet for a moment. "For what it's worth, I think you're probably right. But the captain doesn't like being second-guessed, especially not by—" He stopped himself. "By a doll?" Hallie finished for him. Brennan had the decency to look uncomfortable. "I wasn't going to say that. But you were thinking it." Hallie began reassembling the rifle. "It's fine. I've been hearing it my whole career. The joke stops being funny when the bullets start flying." "You really climbed to 1,900 meters in Helmand?" Brennan asked, changing the subject. 2,200, Hallie corrected. "But I only claimed 1,900 on paper. Anything over 2,000, people start asking questions. Start wanting to study you. I prefer to be underestimated." "Mission accomplished on that front," Brennan said with a slight smile. Hallie snapped the bolt into place with a satisfying metallic click. She lifted the rifle, checking the scope alignment by focusing on a distant point across the room. Satisfied, she set it down gently. "Get some sleep, Brennan," she said. "Tomorrow's going to be ugly. What about you?" "I'll sleep when I'm dead." Hallie pulled out a laminated map and a red grease pencil. "Right now, I have a mountain to memorize." Brennan stood, hesitated, then spoke quietly. "If things go sideways tomorrow, I'm glad you'll be out there. even if the captain won't say it. He left before Hallie could respond. She sat alone with her rifle and her maps, planning for a battle no one else believed was coming. 0400 hours arrived with the inevitability of a headsman's axe. The team assembled on the tarmac in the pre-dawn darkness, the air already warm and oppressive. The MH-60 Black Hawk helicopter sat on the pad, rotors beginning to turn, creating a rhythmic thumping that vibrated through the chest. The crew chief performed final checks, his movements efficient and practiced. Hallie stood slightly apart from the main group, her gear secured and triple-checked. The chai tack was strapped to her back in its drag bag, the weight familiar and almost comforting. Her ruck weighed 72 pounds. She had weighed it 3 times to be certain. Body armor, ammunition, water, survival gear, climbing equipment, medical kit, communications gear. Everything she needed to be self-sufficient for 72 hours. Captain Blackwood walked down the line, inspecting his men with the eye of a craftsman checking his tools. He paused at Hallie, looking down at her with an expression that might have been concern or might have been annoyance. "Last chance to stay behind, Thorne," he said. "No shame in admitting this is beyond your physical capacity." "I'm good to go, sir," Hallie replied. Blackwood studied her for a moment longer, then nodded curtly. "Stay with Kruger. He'll set the pace. If you fall more than 50 meters behind, we leave you with a radio and a grid coordinate for pickup. Clear?" "Crystal, sir." The team boarded the helicopter, the crew chief directing them to their positions with hand signals. Hallie took the rear seat, the position of least importance, where the new guy or the tag-along usually sat. She buckled her harness and pulled her headset on, the foam cushions blocking out some of the rotor noise. The pilot's voice crackled over the internal comms. "Viper 1, this is Eagle 1. All passengers secure, ready for departure." "Eagle 1, Viper 1, take us up," Blackwood responded. The helicopter shuddered, the turbines spooling up to full power. The skids lifted off the tarmac with a lurch, and the world fell away beneath them. The base shrank to a collection of lights in dark shapes, and then they were flying low and fast over the desert, the rotors beating the air into submission. Hallie looked out the open door. The landscape below was a study in shadows and starlight, empty and vast. In the distance to the west, she could see it. A darkness that was not night, a solid wall of deeper black against the sky, blotting out the stars as it approached. The haboo, the monster storm, the thing that would change everything. She checked her watch. 12 hours, maybe less. The flight lasted 30 minutes. The helicopter flared hard, kicking up a cloud of dust as it touched down on a flat stretch of hardpan. The crew chief threw open the doors and shouted over the noise, 30 seconds! Move! 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 The team poured out, spreading into a defensive perimeter, while the helicopter lifted off again, the wash from the rotors creating a brief, blinding dust storm. Then it was gone, the sound fading into the distance, leaving only the wind and the silence of the desert. Blackwood took a knee, consulting his GPS unit and compass. He made a series of hand signals, directing the team into a ranger file formation. Single line, 10-meter spacing between each man. Standard movement formation for terrain where ambush was possible, but not imminent. "Move out," Blackwood whispered into his radio. "Kruger, set the pace. I want us on the ridge line before sunrise." The team moved out, and the pace Blackwood had ordered was not a patrol speed, it was a punishment. Kruger, at 6'3" and 230 pounds of muscle, moved with long, loping strides that ate up the broken ground. His legs were like pistons, efficient and tireless. The men behind him matched his pace easily, their taller frames covering distance with mechanical precision. For Hallie, every step was a calculation of biomechanics and willpower. At 4'9", she could not simply step over obstacles the others cleared with ease. She had to navigate them. The terrain was a nightmare of loose shale and jagged limestone that threatened to twist an ankle with every misplaced boot. Rocks that came to mid-shin on the others came to her knees. Slopes that were mildly steep for them were near vertical for her shorter legs. The weight of the ruck cut into her trapezius muscles, creating a burning ache that radiated down her spine. The straps dug deep enough to restrict blood flow, making her fingers tingle with numbness. She adjusted them repeatedly, trying to find a position that did not feel like slow strangulation. 10 minutes into the march, sweat began to sting her eyes. 20 minutes in, her lungs were burning as if she were inhaling broken glass. She focused on the boots of the man in front of her, Kruger, watching the steady rhythm of his steps. She refused to let the gap widen beyond the mandated 10 meters. "Check your spacing, Thorne." Blackwood's voice crackled in her earpiece. "You're drifting." Hallie did not waste breath on a reply. She surged forward, ignoring the screaming protest of her quadriceps, closing the gap. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a prisoner demanding release. They wanted her to quit. They were waiting for her to call a halt, to beg for a break, to prove that biology was destiny. She would die of cardiac arrest before she gave them the satisfaction. An hour into the march, the terrain grew steeper. They scrambled up a scree slope, loose gravel sliding beneath their boots. Kruger paused at the top, ostensibly to check his compass, but Hallie saw him glance back, watching her struggle for purchase, her boots sliding on the loose rock, the barrel of her massive rifle catching on a low-hanging branch. She clawed her way up, fingers digging into the gravel, pulling herself forward with pure stubbornness. Kruger waited until she was 5 meters away, then spoke loud enough for the others to hear. "Heavy load for a little lady," he said, his voice carrying false concern. He reached out a hand toward her rifle. "Why don't you let me take the cannon? You look like you're about to snap in half." It was the turning point. The offer was not chivalry. It was an insult wrapped in practicality. If she handed over her weapon, she would cease to be a soldier. She would become a protected asset, a passenger. Hallie slapped his hand away. The sound was sharp, like a dry twig snapping. "Touch my weapon," she hissed, her eyes dark and fierce behind her ballistic glasses. "And you'll lose a finger. I carry my own kit." Kruger blinked, surprised by the venom in the small woman's voice. He held up his hands in mock surrender and turned back to the climb. But the smirk was gone. Hallie adjusted her footing, drove her boots into the gravel, and pushed herself up the slope. The anger was better than exhaustion. It was fuel. She burned it to keep moving. By the time they crested the ridge overlooking the Devil's Throat Valley, the sun was beginning to rise. The team went to a knee, scanning the vast depression below. The canyon was a scar in the earth, dark and foreboding even in the growing light. Blackwood signaled for a halt. He pulled out his map, frowning as he compared it to the terrain. Then he looked up at the sky. The air had changed. The dry heat was being replaced by something stranger, a static charge that made the hair on arms stand up. The western horizon was no longer visible. It was obscured by a wall of beige that seemed to stretch from earth to heaven, undulating like a living thing. "Sir," Hallie whispered into her mic, her breath finally steadying now that they had stopped. "Look at the sky." Blackwood looked up, his eyes narrowed. The haboo was no longer a probability on a weather report. It was a physical presence, a monster storm bearing down on them with the weight of geological time. "How long until it hits?" Blackwood asked, his voice tight. Hallie checked her kestrel meter, reading the barometric pressure and wind speed. 4 hours, maybe less. Blackwood studied the canyon below, then the approaching storm, then his men. Hallie could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. He was calculating risk versus reward, speed versus caution. "That gives us a window," he finally said. "The noise will cover our insertion. We move fast, hit the compound, hunker down before the worst hits. This could work in our favor." Hallie moved closer, kneeling near a cluster of scrub brush. Something had caught her eye, an irregularity in the natural chaos of the desert floor. She pulled out a small flashlight and shown it into the depression near a limestone outcrop. Tire tracks, deep, wide treads pressed into the hard-packed earth. "Sir," Hallie called out, "you need to see this." Blackwood sighed audibly and walked over. Kruger and Brennan followed, their expressions showing varying degrees of annoyance. "What now, Thorne?" "Tire tracks," Hallie said, pointing. "Heavy-duty run-flat combat tires. Look at the tread pattern. This isn't a civilian vehicle. This is military-grade, probably an up-armored technical or troop transport." Blackwood squinted at the dirt. "This is a smuggling corridor, Thorne. Local warlords run opium and weapons through here in old Soviet trucks all the time. It doesn't mean the target knows we're coming. The compression depth suggests fully loaded vehicles," Hallie countered. "And there's not just one set of tracks. There are overlaps. 3, maybe 4 vehicles. They move through here." She checked the edge of the impression, running her gloved finger along it. The edges were sharp, not eroded by wind. "Less than 2 hours ago, heading directly for the ridgeline overlooking the valley. If they were setting an ambush, our drones would have picked up heat signatures before the weather turned," Blackwood argued. "We had eyes on this valley until an hour ago. Nothing but rocks and wind." "They could have arrived after the last drone pass," Hallie said, standing up to face him. At 4'9", the top of her helmet barely reached his chest. "Sir, if we go into that valley and those vehicles are on the ridge, we're walking into a grave. We need to clear the high ground first." "Negative," Blackwood's voice hardened. "We don't have time to play it safe. The storm is our cover. We go low, we go fast. Viper team, on me, double time." He turned and signaled the team forward. The SEALs moved out without hesitation, descending the slope toward the darkening maw of the canyon floor. They moved with the confidence of men who believed technology and firepower made them invincible. Hallie stood still, the wind whipping her clothing. Sand was starting to sting her exposed cheeks. She looked at the descending team, then up at the jagged spine of the mountain range to her east. Hill 3050 loomed like a watchful sentinel, its peak already obscured by the leading edge of the approaching storm. Her gut twisted with the same feeling she had experienced in Helmand Province, seconds before an IED detonated. The silence before the scream. If she followed them down, she would be just another gun in a kill zone, blind and useless when the storm hit. If she went up, she would be disobeying a direct order from a superior officer in a combat zone. Court-martial. Dishonorable discharge. The end of everything she had worked for. But if she did nothing, they would die. Hallie looked at Blackwood's retreating back one last time. He was not listening. He would not listen until the first bullet cracked past his ear. She made her choice. She did not follow the file down into the canyon. Instead, she shifted her weight, checked the seal on her optical scope, and turned toward the steep, unforgiving ascent of the eastern cliffs. "Going dark," she whispered into her radio, reaching up to turn the volume down to barely audible. She began to climb. A lone shadow detaching itself from the pack, moving upward as the sky fell down. Behind her, Blackwood's voice crackled with rage over the radio. "Thorne, return to formation immediately. That is a direct order. Thorne, do you copy? If you do not acknowledge in 5 seconds, I am logging this as desertion under fire." Hallie twisted the volume knob until the voice was nothing but a ghost in her ear. She needed silence. She needed to feel the rock, to judge the friction of stone against her boots. She needed absolute focus. The climb would take everything she had, and if she failed, if she fell, no one would come looking for her body. But if she succeeded, she would save them all. The mountain rose before her, vertical and merciless. Hallie Thorne reached up, jammed her fingers into a crack in the limestone, and pulled herself skyward. Below, Viper team disappeared into the Devil's Throat, walking into darkness. Above, the storm wall swept closer, a tsunami of earth and wind that would swallow the world. And between them, one small woman climbed toward the only vantage point that mattered, carrying a rifle and a promise she intended to keep. The rock face was not merely steep, it was a vertical rejection of human presence, a wall of ancient limestone that had stood for millennia and had no interest in accommodating the ambitions of a woman who weighed barely more than her equipment. Hallie Thorne clung to the mountain, her fingers jammed into a crevice barely wide enough for the first knuckle. The wind was no longer just a sound. It was a physical force, a massive hand trying to peel her off the cliff face and hurl her into the void below. 300 feet up, another 200 to go before she reached the summit plateau of Hill 3050. Her fingertips screamed. The limestone was sharp, aggressive, designed by geology to cut and tear. Through the shredded fabric of her gloves, she could feel the warm wetness of blood making her grip slick. Every muscle in her forearms burned with the particular agony of sustained tension, the kind of pain that whispered seductive lies about letting go, about rest, about the sweet release of gravity. She ignored the whispers. She had learned long ago that pain was just information, and information could be filed away and dealt with later. The ShyTac M200 intervention strapped to her back was a lead anchor, its barrel scraping against the stone with every upward lunge, the weight threatening to pull her center of gravity away from the wall. At 35 pounds, the rifle system was nearly a third of her body weight, distributed in the worst possible way for climbing. But she could not leave it. The rifle was not just a tool, it was the reason for the climb. Her right boot found a narrow ledge, barely an inch wide. She tested it with half her weight, feeling the stone for stability. It held. She committed, pushing up, her left hand reaching for a horn of rock 6 inches above her head. Her fingers closed around it. She pulled. The world was reduced to a sequence of singular movements. Reach, test, commit, breathe. The mental checklist that kept climbers alive when the margin between success and death was measured in finger strength and will. At 4 feet 9 inches, Hallie had advantages on vertical terrain that her larger colleagues could never match. Her strength-to-weight ratio was exceptional. Where a 200-pound man had to haul all that mass upward with brute force, she could flow from hold to hold with the efficiency of a spider. Her smaller hands and feet could exploit features that would be useless to someone with size 12 boots and ham-sized fists. But the disadvantages were equally real. Her reach was shorter. Moves that would be a simple stretch for a tall climber required dynamic lunges for her. Moments of controlled falling where all 4 limbs left the rock simultaneously. And the weight of the rifle negated every natural advantage she possessed. Above her, the leading edge of the haboo struck the peak. The world went from twilight to darkness in seconds, the brown wall of dust swallowing the sun. Visibility dropped to near zero. The temperature plummeted as the superheated air was displaced by the cooler mass of the storm. The wind hit with the force of a freight train, howling across the exposed cliff face with sustained gusts that had to be pushing 60 knots. Hallie pressed herself flat against the rock, becoming part of the stone. The dust bit into every exposed surface, finding its way past her ballistic glasses, into her nose, her mouth, the collar of her uniform. It was like being sandblasted, a constant abrasive assault that would strip skin given enough time. She could not see. The rock face disappeared into a brown void 6 inches from her face. She navigated by touch alone, her fingers reading the stone like braille, finding the cracks and ledges and solution pockets that would accept her weight. Time became meaningless. She did not know if she had been climbing for 5 minutes or 50. The only reality was the next handhold, the next foothold, the next breath between mouthfuls of dust. Her right hand found the edge of something flat. She explored it with her fingers, mapping its shape. A ledge. A real ledge. Not just a narrow lip, but a horizontal surface wide enough to stand on. The summit plateau. Hallie pulled herself over the edge and collapsed onto the flat rock, gasping for air that was more dust than oxygen. Her body shook with exhaustion, her muscles twitching with the aftershocks of sustained effort. For 10 seconds, she allowed herself the luxury of simply existing, of not fighting gravity or wind or doubt. Then she rolled onto her stomach and got to work. The summit of Hill 3050 was a flat expanse of broken limestone, roughly 30 meters across, ringed by boulders that provided some shelter from the wind. It was not comfortable, but comfort had never been part of the job description. Hallie crawled toward the northern edge, the direction of the canyon floor, dragging the rifle case behind her. She pulled the shy tack from its drag bag, her hands moving with practiced efficiency despite the trembling in her fingers. She deployed the bipod, driving the legs deep into gravel until they found purchase. She pulled the drag bag forward and stuffed it with loose rocks, creating a stable rest for the buttstock. She checked the scope, ensuring no dust had infiltrated the sealed optics. Clean. She pressed her eye to the scope and activated the thermal imaging unit clipped in front of the daytime optic. The world transformed. The swirling brown chaos disappeared, replaced by the clean digital contrast of grayscale. The thermal sensor read infrared radiation, the heat signature of objects against the background temperature. The storm was invisible to this technology. It could only see warmth. And 3 kilometers below, huddled near a cluster of boulders on the canyon floor, 7 distinct heat signatures glowed white-hot against the cooling rocks. Viper Team, alive, stationary. Hallie felt something tight in her chest release, just slightly. They had made it to cover before the worst of the storm hit. They were blind, pinned down by wind and dust, but they were alive. She panned the scope slowly, scanning the surrounding terrain, the ridges, the approaches, the high ground she had warned them about. Her heart stopped. On the opposite ridge, parallel to her position but 200 meters lower in elevation, 9 heat signatures were moving in tactical formation. They were not the erratic stumbling of civilians caught in a storm. This was purposeful movement, disciplined intervals, the signature of trained fighters who knew exactly where they were going. They were carrying long, tubular objects on their backs. Hallie increased magnification, her breath catching in her throat. Mortar tubes, RPG launchers, heavy weapons. This was not a patrol. This was a hunter-killer team, and they were setting up a perfect L-shaped ambush with overlapping fields of fire. They knew Viper Team was in the canyon. They were using the Habu as cover, moving under the cloak of noise and blindness to establish a kill zone. The doll had been right, and no one was listening. Hallie reached for her radio with trembling fingers, keying the mic. Viper 1, this is Overwatch. Break. You have multiple contacts maneuvering on your east flank. Elevation 200, distance 400 meters from your position. 9 hostiles, heavy weapons. Ambush imminent. Static. A wash of white noise hissed back at her, the sound of electromagnetic interference from the ionized dust. Captain Blackwood, do you copy? Ambush imminent. Move your team now. Nothing but the hiss of the storm, the ghost voices of a failed communication system. She watched through the scope, helpless, as the enemy team stopped. They began to dismantle the tubes from their backs, setting up firing positions. The heat bloom of a mortar baseplate being anchored into the ground was unmistakable. They were methodical, professional. This was not the first time they had done this. Hallie looked at her rifle. She checked the range with the laser rangefinder built into the scope. 3,050 meters, 3.05 kilometers. It was a distance that existed beyond the edge of most ballistic charts. A range where bullets spent so much time in flight that wind, temperature, humidity, and the rotation of the Earth itself became significant variables in the equation. At this range, the bullet would be in the air for nearly 4 seconds. 4 seconds of flight time, during which the wind could push the projectile dozens of feet off course. 4 seconds during which the target could move, duck, or simply cease to exist as a valid point of aim. It was, by any reasonable standard, an impossible shot. and she would have to make it 9 times. Hallie looked down at Viper Team, glowing and unaware in the thermal image. Captain Blackwood, Kruger, Brennan, the men who had mocked her, dismissed her, called her a doll. They were 30 seconds away from annihilation, and they did not even know it. Communication was dead. The chain of command was broken. There was no one to ask for permission, no one to validate her calculations, no one to tell her she was authorized to engage. She was alone with her rifle and her conscience. Hallie Thorne exhaled slowly, purging the doubt from her lungs, along with the dust-laden air. She slid her finger into the trigger guard of the Chi-Tac, feeling the familiar curve of the metal against her skin. "I am the radio now," she whispered to the storm. The first shot would tell them everything they needed to know. The ambush did not begin with a shout or a warning. It began with the rhythmic, mechanical thumping of a PKM machine gun tearing through the storm, the sound arriving seconds before the impacts, as supersonic rounds chewed into the boulders protecting Viper Team. 3,000 meters below Hallie's position, the world exploded for Captain Garrett Blackwood. He had been crouched behind a limestone outcrop, checking his GPS unit and cursing the static on his radio when the first rounds hit. The air around him erupted in geysers of pulverized rock and ricocheting metal. The sound was overwhelming, a sustained roar that drowned out even the wind. "Contact! Contact right!" Blackwood screamed into his radio, knowing no one could hear him, needing to scream anyway. 3 o'clock! Suppressing fire! But 3 o'clock was meaningless in a world where the horizon had been erased. The Habu had reduced their reality to a sphere of brown chaos 10 meters in diameter. They could not see the enemy. They could only react to muzzle flashes that appeared like lightning in the murk, gone before eyes could track them. Kruger swung his M249 SAW in the direction of the incoming fire and unleashed a long burst, the weapon shaking in his massive hands as it vomited brass casings onto the rocks. The act was futile, firing at ghosts, but it was better than dying without fighting back. "Return fire! Suppress them!" Kruger roared, his voice barely audible over the cacophony. The team scattered to whatever cover they could find, their carefully planned formation disintegrating under the weight of incoming violence. They had been caught in the exact scenario Hallie had warned them about, pinned in a depression with enemy on the high ground, blind and outmaneuvered. Blackwood scrambled toward a low rock shelf, trying to rally his men, trying to make sense of the chaos. A round caught him in the left shoulder, spinning him like a rag doll. The impact felt like being hit with a sledgehammer, a massive blunt force that shut down his entire left side. He hit the ground hard, the breath driven from his lungs, tasting blood and dust. His hand went to his shoulder. It came away red and wet. Through and through, probably a ricochet off the rocks, but it rendered his left arm useless. The pain came seconds later, a white-hot spike that threatened to shut down his consciousness. Through the haze of shock and pain, a terrible clarity settled over him. The tire tracks, the warning about the canyon, the plea to secure the high ground. She told us. The realization was more bitter than the blood in his mouth. He had led his men into a slaughterhouse because he could not tolerate being questioned by someone who weighed 100 pounds and stood barely tall enough to ride a roller coaster. 3,000 meters above, Hallie Thorne watched the massacre unfold to her thermal scope with the detached calm of a surgeon. She saw Blackwood go down, his heat signature flaring bright around the wound as blood, warmer than ambient temperature, soaked his uniform. She saw the team's defensive perimeter collapsing inward, contracting like a dying star. But her attention was locked on the greater threat. On the opposite ridge, the enemy mortar team had finished setting up. The tube was angled high, pointed directly at the depression where Viper Team was pinned. One of the fighters held a mortar round, preparing to drop it down the tube. Once that round left the tube, the men below were dead. The confined space of the rocky depression would focus the blast wave, amplifying its lethality. The shrapnel would ricochet off every surface, turning the entire area into a blender of supersonic metal. Hallie's world narrowed to the dimensions of her scope. The crosshairs settled on the man holding the mortar round. He was 3,050 meters away, standing on a ridge 200 meters lower than her position, surrounded by swirling dust that would push her bullet sideways with invisible hands. She checked her data. Wind at her position, 45 knots, gusting to 60. Temperature dropping rapidly. Barometric pressure still falling. Humidity near zero. The ballistic computer in her scope fed her a firing solution, but it was based on assumptions that might be wrong. She had to aim 40 feet to the left of her target. She had to trust 4 years of training, 10,000 practice rounds, and the mathematics of violence. Hallie dialed the elevation turret. 73 minutes of angle. The click sounded like a countdown. She dialed the windage. 32 minutes right, compensating for the left-to-right crosswind. Her crosshairs now rested on empty air, on a point in space where nothing existed. To hit the target, she had to shoot at nothing and trust the invisible forces would bend her bullet back toward flesh. She waited for the wind. Not for it to stop, it would not stop, but for a lull, a microsecond of lesser chaos. The gust meter on her kestrel showed a momentary drop, 50 knots to 42. Now. Sending it, Hallie whispered. She squeezed the trigger. The mechanism was smooth, a glass rod breaking, no creep or hesitation. The rifle erupted. The muzzle brake channeled gases sideways, kicking up a cloud of dust that momentarily obscured her vision. The recoil slammed into her shoulder like a freight train, a violent reminder that physics did not care about her size. The bullet, a 419-grain solid copper projectile, screamed out of the 30-inch barrel at 2,900 feet per second. 1 second. The bullet stabilized in flight, spinning at 180,000 revolutions per minute, gyroscopic forces keeping it pointed true even as wind tried to push it off course. 2 seconds. Gravity pulled it downward in a parabolic arc. The bullet had already dropped 50 feet from the line of bore, falling through space at an accelerating rate. 3 seconds. The wind pushed it laterally, the forces complex and chaotic, turbulence from the storm creating eddies and vortices that buffeted the projectile like a leaf in a hurricane. 3.8 seconds. The bullet, now subsonic, tumbled slightly as it lost stability, the transonic transition creating minor perturbations in its flight path. Impact. Through the thermal scope, Hallie watched the enemy mortar loader jerk violently, his torso snapping backward as if yanked by invisible wires. The heat signature bloomed bright white as the copper projectile, carrying 3,000 foot-pounds of kinetic energy, punched through his chest and exploded out his back in a spray of superheated tissue. The mortar round tumbled from his hands, rolling harmlessly down the slope. There was no sound of impact at this range, no confirmation except the visual evidence of sudden, catastrophic violence. The man crumpled. He simply ceased to function, his strings cut, his heat signature dimming as blood cooled on the rocks. Down in the valley, Captain Blackwood flinched, expecting the mortar explosion. Instead, he saw something impossible through the brown murk. One of the enemy fighters on the ridge above him suddenly dropped, a spray of dark mist erupting from his torso. There was no gunshot. The sound, if it existed, was swallowed by the storm. The enemy team froze. Confusion rippled through their formation. They looked around, searching for the threat. They knew the Americans below did not have the angle or the range. They knew the sound signature was wrong. Someone had just reached out from nowhere and removed one of them from existence. Blackwood pressed himself into the rock, his mind racing through tactical impossibilities. The angle was too steep. The sound was wrong. Unless... He turned his head slowly, looking back toward the eastern cliffs, toward the towering spire of Hill 3050 that was now invisible in the storm. "Thorn," he breathed, the word half prayer, half disbelief. 3,000 meters above, Hallie cycled the bolt, the brass casing ejected, spinning through the air before clinking onto the limestone. The sound was crisp and final, a period at the end of a sentence. She did not celebrate. She did not pause to admire her work. She immediately settled back into the stock, her eye returning to the glass. The confusion below would only last seconds. Then they would start looking for her, or they would scatter. She could not allow either. "One down," she whispered, her voice empty of emotion. "8 to go." She shifted the crosshairs to the next heat signature, a man reaching for the fallen mortar tube, trying to complete the mission his comrade had started. The doll was done playing. The surgeon was at work. Target 2, radio operator. He was crouched behind a rock 30 meters from the mortar position, frantically working a handheld radio. He thought he was in cover. From the valley floor, he was. But from Hallie's God's eye view, his entire torso was exposed. She adjusted for the slightly different range, 3,020 meters. She compensated for the new wind angle as he had moved to a different aspect relative to her position. The mathematics were different for every shot, a constantly shifting puzzle of physics and probability. She exhaled, found the stillness, squeezed. The rifle roared. 4 seconds of flight time. The radio operator's head snapped back violently, the thermal scope showing the catastrophic disruption of his cranial vault. The backpack radio sparked and died as the bullet passed through equipment and man alike, destroying both. The enemy team's link to their command structure died with him. Blackwood, pressed into the dirt of the canyon floor, heard the distinctive, heavy crack of a high-velocity round passing overhead. Not the sharp, supersonic snap of a nearby shot, but the deeper, more ominous sound of a bullet that had traveled a great distance before arriving. It was the sound of artillery, of reach, of someone operating at ranges that should not be possible. Another enemy fighter dropped on the ridge, this one simply ceasing to exist in the middle of trying to change positions. No muzzle flash from the valley, no sound that made sense. "Overwatch," Blackwood gasped into his radio, his voice thick with pain and awe. "Thorn, do you copy? Give me a sit rep." Static. But not the dead, empty static of before. This was different. This was the static of a signal trying to break through, modulated by something intelligent on the other end. Then, cutting through the interference, a voice. Calm, professional, absolutely devoid of emotion or vindication. "Viper 1, this is Overwatch. Enemy is regrouping north of your position. Your east flank is open. Move to the 3 o'clock ridge. I will clear the path." It was not a request. It was not a suggestion. It was a statement of tactical reality delivered by someone who could see what he could not. "Copy, Overwatch," Blackwood said, the words catching in his throat. "Moving east." He turned to his team. "You heard her. On your feet. We move to the eastern ridge. Go, go, go!" The SEALs did not hesitate. They trusted Blackwood. And right now, Blackwood was trusting the woman he had called a doll. They broke from cover, moving low and fast across the open ground, expecting at any moment to be cut down by the machine gun fire that had pinned them seconds before. The fire never came, because Hallie was faster. Target 3, machine gunner. He was the immediate threat, the PKM laying down suppressing fire that would shred anyone caught in the open. He was prone behind a low berm, the weapon mounted on its bipod, belt-fed ammunition snaking from a metal can at his side. Hallie did not aim at the man. She aimed at the ammunition can. The Shytac barked. The API round, armor-piercing incendiary, struck the metal can and punched through. The burning phosphorus compound in the bullet's tip ignited the propellant in the linked cartridges. The can exploded in a brilliant white flare visible even through the storm, a cascading detonation that consumed the gunner and his weapon in a ball of flame. The suppressing fire stopped. Viper team sprinted across the gap, reaching the cover of the eastern ridge unscathed. They pressed themselves into the rocks, gasping for breath, staring at each other with the wide-eyed look of men who had just walked through a minefield and somehow found every step between the mines. Jesus Christ, Kruger breathed. She's killing them all. She's saving us all, Brennan corrected, his medic's bag already open, pulling out bandages for Blackwood's shoulder. On the opposite ridge, the enemy team was no longer a cohesive unit. They were terrified individuals, firing blindly into the storm, trying to find the ghost that was picking them off, one by one. They did not understand that the ghost was not in the storm. She was above it, looking down like a hawk circling over prey. Target 4, squad leader. He was waving his arms trying to rally his men, shouting orders that were lost in the wind. Leadership. Remove the leadership and the unit collapses. Hallie fired. The squad leader dropped mid-gesture, his arms still raised as if appealing to a god who did not answer. Target 5. Fighter attempting to flee. He had broken cover, running downslope toward dead ground where he thought he would be safe. Hallie led him like a clay pigeon, calculating his speed, his angle, the arc of his descent. She squeezed the trigger. He tumbled, momentum carrying his corpse another 20 meters down the slope before it came to rest against a boulder. 5 down, 4 to go. The enemy was breaking. 2 fighters threw down their weapons and ran, disappearing into the storm without looking back. Hallie let them go. She was not hunting for sport. She was eliminating threats. The 2 remaining fighters were smarter or more disciplined. They went to ground in a cluster of rocks that offered overhead protection, making themselves small, trying to become invisible. But thermal imaging did not care about cover. It saw warmth, and warm bodies glowed like beacons. Hallie shifted position slightly, changing her angle of fire. From her elevated position, she could see into their hiding spot, the slight difference in perspective making their cover useless. Target 6. The leftmost fighter. She fired. He slumped. Target 7. The fighter in the center realized they were being shot from above. He looked up, trying to spot the muzzle flash through the storm. Hallie fired before he finished turning his head. He looked up at the sky and died looking up. 7 down. Hallie scanned the ridge, searching for the 8th and 9th signatures. There. Moving fast, low-crawling toward a technical truck that was parked in defilade behind a large boulder. The vehicle was an up-armored Toyota Land Cruiser, the kind favored by irregular forces throughout the region. Mounted on the back was a heavy DSHK machine gun, a relic of Soviet wars but still capable of putting half-inch rounds through engine blocks at a mile. If that truck made it into the open, if that gun came to bear on Viper Team's position, all of her work would be undone. The DSHK could chew through the rocks they were hiding behind. It could pin them down long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Targets 8 and 9. The vehicle and its crew. Hallie reached into her magazine pouch and pulled out her last API round. She had been saving it for exactly this scenario. She fed it into the chamber, the brass case sliding home with a smooth click. The truck's engine started. A plume of hot exhaust gases bloomed in the thermal image as the diesel motor rumbled to life. The vehicle lurched forward, accelerating hard, bouncing over rough terrain toward a position where the heavy machine gun would have a clear line of fire. Hallie had one chance. The truck was moving at perhaps 30 kilometers per hour, weaving between boulders, the driver trying to present a difficult target. At 3,000 meters, she needed to lead the vehicle by nearly 40 meters, aiming at a point in space the truck would occupy 4 seconds in the future. She tracked the movement, her crosshairs dancing ahead of the target, predicting the path. The truck would have to thread a gap between 2 large boulders. It would have to slow down, just for a second. The nose of the truck entered the gap. The driver tapped the brakes. Hallie squeezed the trigger. The Shytac bucked against her shoulder, the recoil finding the bruise already forming from the previous 7 shots. The pain was sharp and bright, a reminder that she was still human, still breakable. The bullet flew. 4 seconds of mathematics and faith. The API round struck the front of the engine block, punching through the radiator, through the cast iron casing, through fuel lines and electrical systems. The incendiary compound ignited. The engine did not just fail, it exploded. Through the thermal scope, the result was blinding. The heat bloom expanded instantly, a miniature sun erupting in the storm. The kinetic force of the blast, combined with the forward momentum of the truck, caused it to flip, somersaulting forward like a toy thrown by an angry child. It crashed down on its roof in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. A secondary explosion ripped through the chassis as the ammunition stored for the DSHK cooked off, the heavy rounds detonating in a sustained crackle that sounded like firecrackers. Hallie pulled her eye from the scope, blinking against the strain. Her vision swam, doubled for a moment before stabilizing. She was lightheaded, the altitude and the adrenaline dump combining to make the world feel distant and unreal. She keyed her mic. Viper 1, this is Overwatch. All threats neutralized. 9 confirmed kills. Your path to the extraction LZ is clear. Silence on the radio. Then Blackwood's voice, rough with pain and something that might have been humility. Good kills, Overwatch. Outstanding work. We're moving to the LZ now. Hallie allowed herself a single, deep breath. The mission was not over. Extraction was always the most dangerous phase, but the immediate threat was gone. She had bought them time. She began to break down her shooting position, preparing to descend. And that was when she heard it. Not through the radio, through the air. The scrape of a boot on stone. The heavy, ragged breathing of men exerting themselves at altitude. Someone was climbing toward her position. Hallie spun, bringing the Shytac around. But the weapon was useless at close range, a 35-pound club. She dropped it, her hand reaching for the Sig Sauer P226 pistol on her hip. A head appeared over the ledge, wrapped in a shamag, eyes wide with fear and fury. Then a second, a third. 3 enemy fighters who had spotted the trajectory of her shots, who had traced the geometry back to its source, who wanted revenge for their dead comrades. The first man pulled himself onto the plateau, an AK-47 slung across his chest. He saw her. His eyes widened in confusion. Perhaps he had expected a team of snipers. Perhaps he had expected special forces operators. Instead, he saw a small woman, alone, barely tall enough to see over the rifle that lay at her feet. For a critical second, confusion held him motionless. Hallie did not hesitate. Her hand closed on the M18A1 Claymore mine she had positioned earlier, the firing clacker already in her palm. She had anticipated this exact scenario. The chess player in her had seen 3 moves ahead. She squeezed the clacker 3 times in rapid succession. The claymore detonated. 700 steel ball bearings, each the size of a marble, exploded outward at 4,000 feet per second in a 60-degree arc. The blast was focused, directional, a horizontal guillotine of supersonic metal that shredded everything in its path. But it was not just the steel. The overpressure from the explosive, focused by the shape of the mine, slammed into the already unstable limestone of the cliff edge. The rock, weakened by millions of years of erosion and thermal stress, gave way. A massive section of the ledge collapsed, taking the 3 fighters with it into the storm-dark void below. They did not scream. There was no time. They simply ceased to exist, erased by gravity and violence. The blast wave hit Hallie like a truck. She was thrown backward, her head cracking against the rock wall behind her. The world went white, then black, then a painful, ringing gray. Debris rained down, fist-sized rocks, gravel, dust that was no longer just dust, but pulverized stone and pulverized men. A sharp shard of limestone sliced across her cheek, hot and bright. Another struck her left thigh, deadening the leg instantly with the deep, nauseating pain of bone bruise. Hallie lay on her back, staring up at the brown sky, her ears ringing so loudly she could not hear the wind anymore. She tried to sit up. The world spun. She slumped back. Her hand found the grip of her pistol, still holstered. She had not needed it. The mind had done the work. She rolled onto her side, gasping for air that tasted of copper and cordite. Blood trickled down her face, warm and sticky. Her left leg refused to obey commands. A dead weight attached to her hip. She crawled toward the edge of the plateau, looking down. The path she had climbed was gone. The explosion and the rock slide had erased it, leaving only a vertical expanse of loose scree and razor-sharp shale, dropping 500 feet before leveling out into a steep slope. There was no way down, not by climbing. And then she heard it, faint through the ringing in her ears, the distinctive thump, thump, thump of helicopter rotors. The MH-60 Blackhawk coming for extraction. She looked over the edge of the cliff. Far below, barely visible through the storm, she could see heat signatures. Viper team in a defensive perimeter waiting for the bird. They were not boarding. They were standing in formation looking up, looking for her. They were waiting. Stubborn bastards, Hallie muttered, blood on her teeth. She could not climb down. The path was destroyed. She did not have the strength left anyway. Her arms were shaking, her fingers stripped raw, her leg useless. But she could surf. Hallie tightened every strap on her gear, securing the shy-tack to her back with paracord, pulling it tight enough to cut into her shoulders. She grabbed a flat piece of limestone, roughly the size of a cafeteria tray. She dragged herself to the steepest section of the scree slope. This was insane. This was suicide. This was the only option. "Coming out," she whispered into her radio. She did not wait for a response. She pulled herself over the edge and jumped. She hit the loose shale and immediately began to slide, accelerating rapidly. She threw the flat stone beneath her, using it as a sled, using the rifle on her back as a rudder. She leaned left and right, steering through the chaos, riding the avalanche she had created. Rocks the size of bowling balls tumbled alongside her. The dust was blinding. The roar of the landslide was deafening. She was falling and flying and dying and living all at once. 500 feet of controlled falling. A violent descent through loose scree that threatened to swallow her whole. She used her boots as brakes, digging in when she accelerated too fast, lifting them when she needed speed to clear obstacles. She hit the transition to the lower slope and tumbled, rolling, the world spinning, sky and ground exchanging places repeatedly. She wrapped her arms around her head, trying to protect her skull, feeling rocks batter her ribs, her back, her legs. She came to rest at the bottom of the slope in a cloud of dust, 50 meters from where the helicopter was hovering. She did not get up. She could not get up. Everything hurt. Everything was broken or bruised or bleeding. "Heads up! Movement on the slope!" Kruger's voice, shouting over the rotor wash. Through the dust, through the pain, Hallie saw massive shapes running toward her. Kruger reached her first. He did not hesitate. He scooped her up as if she weighed nothing, cradling her like a child, his arms gentle despite their size. "I got you, doll," he shouted over the noise. "I got you." But the nickname sounded different now. It was not an insult. It was something else. Something that acknowledged what she had done, what she had proven. They ran for the helicopter, Kruger carrying her, Brennan running alongside with his medical kit already open. They threw themselves into the cabin. Blackwood, his arm in a makeshift sling, slammed the door shut. "Go, go, go!" he shouted to the pilot. The Black Hawk pitched forward, lifting heavily into the sky, the rotors clawing at the air. The ground fell away beneath them, the Devil's Throat Canyon shrinking to a scar in the landscape. Inside the cabin, Hallie lay on the metal floor, her chest heaving, her vision blurring. She was still gripping the shy-tack, her hands locked around it even in her semi-conscious state. Blackwood reached down, intending to take the rifle for safety, to secure the weapon. Hallie's eyes snapped open. Her hand tightened on the rifle. "My weapon," she rasped. Blackwood withdrew his hand immediately. He nodded once. a gesture of respect and understanding. She had earned it. She had earned all of it. The helicopter banked left, leaving the storm behind, flying toward the safety of the base. In the cabin, Viper team sat in silence, watching the small woman who had just saved all their lives, still refusing to let go of the rifle that made her a giant. The interior of the MH-60 Blackhawk was a vibrating metal womb, smelling of hydraulic fluid, stale sweat, and the metallic tang of dried blood. The roar of the twin turbine engines and the rhythmic thumping of the main rotor blades created a wall of sound that made speech nearly impossible, reducing communication to hand signals and the language of thousand-yard stares. Hallie Thorne sat slumped against the canvas webbing of the troop seat, her legs extended straight out in front of her. The adrenaline that had carried her through the climb, the shooting, and the suicidal descent was evaporating like water on hot steel, leaving behind a cold, trembling exhaustion that made her bones feel hollow. Her uniform was torn at the knees and elbows, shredded by limestone and violence. Her face was a mask of gray dust, streaked with sweat and blood, where the flying shale had cut her skin during the explosion. The Shytac M200 lay across her lap, still gripped in hands that refused to release, even in semi-consciousness. Her gloves were destroyed, the fabric shredded at the fingertips, dark with blood that was partly hers and partly absorbed from the rifle itself. The weapon was covered in dust, scratched and battered, but the action was closed and safe. Even broken and bleeding, she had maintained her discipline. Brennan, the team medic, unbuckled his harness and moved across the vibrating floor on his knees. He glanced at Captain Blackwood, whose left arm hung useless in a makeshift sling fashioned from a torn t-shirt, the fabric already soaked through with blood. The captain's face was pale under the grime, his jaw set against pain that would have put most men into shock. Brennan reached for Blackwood's injured shoulder, his hands already pulling a pressure bandage from his medical kit. Blackwood shook his head sharply. He gestured toward Hallie with his good hand, the order unmistakable even without words. "Check her first." Brennan's eyes widened slightly, but he nodded. In the unwritten code of special operations, officers did not yield medical priority to enlisted personnel. That Blackwood would do so now spoke volumes that would echo through the team long after this mission became a story told in quiet bars. Brennan shifted his attention to the small woman slumped in the corner. He moved carefully, as if approaching something wild that might bolt or bite. "Specialist Thorne, I need to check your injuries. Can you hear me?" Hallie's eyes opened, focusing slowly. She tried to wave him off, her instinct to hide weakness still flaring, even as her body betrayed her. But her hand lacked the strength to complete the gesture. Brennan gently pulled a knife from his kit and began cutting away the fabric of her left trouser leg, where a massive rock had struck during the blast. The skin underneath was a horrific canvas of deep purple bruising and lacerations, the kind of injury that spoke of blunt force trauma severe enough to crack bone. Swelling was already distorting the natural contours of her calf and thigh. He poured antiseptic over the wounds. Hallie hissed through her teeth, her head falling back against the fuselage wall, her eyes squeezed shut. The pain was bright and sharp, cutting through the fog of exhaustion. But she did not cry out. She had learned long ago that tears accomplish nothing except to give observers the satisfaction of seeing you break. Across from her, Kruger sat with his head tilted back, staring at the ceiling of the helicopter. His massive hands that could palm a basketball or crush a man's windpipe, were trembling slightly. He lowered his gaze to Hallie, watching Brennan work on her ruined leg. Those same hands were now stained with her blood from when he had carried her to the helicopter. He looked down at his palms, at the rust-colored smears, and something in his expression shifted. It was not quite guilt, not quite shame, but a recognition of profound miscalculation. He nudged the SEAL next to him, a younger operator named Hicks, who still had the kind of jawline that belonged on recruiting posters. Kruger pointed silently at Hallie's hands where they gripped the rifle. Hicks followed the gesture and saw what Kruger had seen. The gloves were not just torn, they were shredded to nothing at the fingertips, the fabric completely gone, exposing raw flesh that had been abraded down to subcutaneous tissue. Blood had soaked into the tactical fabric of the gloves, creating dark stains that extended halfway up her forearms. She had literally torn her hands apart climbing that mountain, and she had done it while carrying a rifle that weighed a third of her body weight. Hicks whispered something to the man next to him, who looked and then passed it along. A silent wave of realization rippled through the team. They were alive because a woman had shredded her own body to reach a position they had declared impossible, then executed 9 perfect shots at a range most of them could not have achieved on their best day at a controlled range. The silence in the cabin became something different. It was no longer the silence of men too tired to speak. It was the silence of men confronting the inadequacy of language to express what they were feeling. Captain Garrett Blackwood watched this realization spread through his team. His own reckoning had come earlier, in the moment he saw the first enemy fighter drop from an impossible distance, killed by a bullet that could only have come from the place he had forbidden anyone to go. He looked at Hallie now, at the way she still held that rifle as if it were the only thing anchoring her to consciousness. He thought about the words he had used: doll, liability, luggage. The shame of it sat in his gut like broken glass. Brennan finished bandaging Hallie's leg and moved to check her other injuries. He examined the cut on her cheek, cleaning it with gentle efficiency. It would scar, a thin line from her cheekbone to her jaw, a permanent reminder of the day she had defied orders and saved 7 men who had not deserved saving. "You need to stay awake, specialist," Brennan said, his voice cutting through the rotor noise. "Possible concussion from that blast. I need you to keep your eyes open." "How long to base?" Hallie's voice was hoarse, abraded by dust and exertion. 10 minutes, Brennan replied. "Then I'll sleep in 11, she said, her eyes drifting closed despite his instructions. Brennan looked to Blackwood with concern. The captain made a gesture that might have been permission or might have been resignation. Let her rest. She had earned it. The Black Hawk banked left, the motion pressing everyone against their restraints. Through the open doors, the landscape scrolled past below, the Devil's Throat Canyon now just a distant scar receding into the haze. The storm was breaking up, the Habu's fury spent, leaving behind a world scrubbed clean and colorless. Kruger leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his eyes still on Hallie. "Hey," he said, loud enough to carry over the engines. "Doll." Hallie's eyes opened, focusing on him with difficulty. "That was the best shooting I've ever seen," Kruger said. His voice was stripped of sarcasm, of condescension, of everything except honest assessment. "I've been doing this for 12 years, worked with Delta, worked with Rangers, worked with the best long gun specialists in SOCOM. What you did up there," he shook his head, "that wasn't shooting, that was surgery." Hallie did not respond immediately. She simply looked at him, evaluating whether this was another test, another setup for humiliation. But Kruger's eyes were steady, sincere. "Just doing my job," she finally said. "No," Blackwood interjected, his voice rough with pain and something deeper. "You did our job too. You did the job I should have done, which was to listen when someone with better information tried to save my life." The helicopter shuddered through turbulence, the frame groaning. No one spoke for a long moment. "For what it's worth," Blackwood continued, "you were right. About everything. The canyon, the tracks, the high ground. I ignored you because I was an arrogant asshole who thought his experience mattered more than your analysis." He paused, working his jaw. "That stops now." Hallie held his gaze. "Permission to speak freely, sir?" "Granted." "I don't need an apology," she said. "I need you to do better next time someone challenges your plan, regardless of who they are or what they look like. Because next time, I might not be there to fix it." The rebuke hung in the air, sharp and clean. It was not delivered with anger or bitterness. It was a professional assessment from one operator to another, the kind of after-action feedback that only peers could deliver. Blackwood absorbed it, nodded once. Understood. The base appeared on the horizon, a collection of tan structures and prefabricated buildings surrounded by HESCO barriers and concertina wire. The helicopter began its descent, the pilot calling in their approach over the radio. The crew chief moved to the door, preparing for landing. 30 seconds, he shouted. The skids touched down with a jolt. The crew chief threw open the doors and the blast of hot air from outside rushed in, carrying with it the smell of jet fuel and baked earth. Medical personnel were already running toward the helicopter, alerted by radio that there were casualties inbound. Brennan jumped out first, waving the medics toward Blackwood. GSW to left shoulder, through and through, significant blood loss. He needs a surgeon now. Two medics moved to Blackwood, helping him out of the helicopter despite his protests. He kept looking back at Hallie, as if afraid she would disappear if he took his eyes off her. Kruger unbuckled and moved to Hallie's position. He reached down, intending to carry her again, but she shook her head. I can walk, she said. Your leg is destroyed, Kruger countered. Then I'll limp. Hallie pushed herself upright, using the rifle as a crutch. She took one step and her left leg buckled immediately. Kruger caught her before she hit the deck. Stubborn as hell, he muttered, but there was admiration in his voice. He picked her up, this time with her permission implied if not explicitly given, and carried her out into the brutal sunlight of the afternoon. A medic tried to take the ShyTac from her as Kruger set her on a stretcher. Hallie's grip tightened. Touch my weapon and you'll need a medic, she said, her voice deadly serious despite her condition. The medic stepped back, hands raised. Kruger gently pried her fingers from the rifle, holding it carefully, treating it with the reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. I've got it, Thorne, he said. I'll clean it, check it, and have it back to you before chow. I promise on my tabs. Hallie searched his eyes, evaluating the sincerity of the promise. Finally, she released her grip. Kruger took the rifle, surprised by its weight even though he had known intellectually how heavy it was. Thank you, she whispered, and then her eyes closed as the medics wheeled her toward the aid station. The team stood on the tarmac, watching her disappear into the medical tent. They were filthy, exhausted, several of them wounded, but they were alive. Every single one of them was breathing because a woman they had dismissed as a quota, a checkbox, a doll, had refused to accept their judgment of her capabilities. Blackwood, being led away by medics who were trying unsuccessfully to get him to lie down, turned back to his team. Debrief in 6 hours. Medical clearance or not, everyone attends. We have paperwork to file. 6 hours later, the Tactical Operations Center felt different. The air conditioning still hummed, the generator still droned, but the atmosphere had changed in a way that was difficult to quantify. Colonel Sterling sat behind his field desk, reviewing the preliminary after-action report with the careful attention of a man who knew that what was written today would be studied in classrooms years from now. Captain Blackwood stood at parade rest in front of the desk, his left arm now properly immobilized in a sling, an IV catheter still taped to his right forearm from the rapid blood transfusion he had received. His face was still pale, but his eyes were clear and focused. Colonel Sterling looked up from the report, a rare smile breaking his weathered features. The colonel was 58 years old, with iron-gray hair cut to military precision and the kind of face that had seen too many flag-draped coffins to ever fully relax. Outstanding work, Captain, Sterling said, tapping the folder. Intelligence confirms 9 hostiles KIA, including a high-value logistics commander we've been hunting for 6 months. You extracted your entire team with 0 fatalities, despite walking into a prepared ambush. He leaned back in his chair. That's the kind of leadership that earns commendations. I'm putting you in for a Bronze Star. Blackwood's jaw tightened. With respect, sir, The report is incomplete. Sterling's eyebrow raised. Incomplete how? The ambush was effective, sir. My team was pinned down and combat ineffective within the first 30 seconds. I was wounded. Communications were compromised. We were approximately 1 minute away from being eliminated by indirect fire. Blackwood stepped forward, reaching for a pen on the colonel's desk. Permission to amend the report, sir? Sterling gestured assent, curiosity evident on his face. Blackwood opened the file to the Mission Success Attribution section. With his good hand, he wrote in clear, deliberate script, Mission success attributed solely to Specialist Hallie Thorne. Confirmed kills, 9. Engagement range, 3,050 meters. Environmental conditions, Class 5 Habu, sustained winds 45 to 60 knots, near zero visibility. He continued writing, Specialist Thorne disobeyed direct orders to remain with the main formation, conducting a solo technical climb to establish overwatch position on Hill 3050. Her tactical assessment of enemy positions and likely ambush sites was accurate. My decision to ignore her analysis nearly resulted in total team loss. Her precision fire eliminated all threats and enabled successful extraction. Sterling read the addendum, his expression shifting from surprise to something approaching awe. He looked up at Blackwood. She made 9 kills at over 3,000 meters? In a sandstorm? Yes, sir. I watched 7 of them through my optics once visibility improved enough to see the ridge. The shots were surgical. No wasted ammunition, no misses. Each kill eliminated a specific tactical threat in order of priority. Blackwood's voice was steady, professional, but beneath it ran a current of something that might have been reverence. She saved 7 lives, sir. If there's a medal to be awarded, it belongs to her, not me. Sterling sat back, processing this information. He had been in the military for 36 years, had seen combat in 3 different conflicts, had commanded at every level from platoon to battalion. In all that time, he had learned that the best leaders were the ones who could admit when they were wrong and give credit where it was due. The problem, Captain, is that what you're describing borders on impossible. 9 kills at that range, in those conditions? The ballistic computers can't even generate reliable firing solutions past 2,000 meters in clear weather. In a Habu? He shook his head. If I put this in the report as written, people will think we're fabricating it for publicity. Then we'll provide the evidence, sir. The Chi-TAC will have carbon scoring consistent with 9 rounds fired. We can recover brass casings from her firing position. We can document her injuries consistent with the climb and defensive engagement. And we have 7 witnesses who will testify under oath that every word of this is accurate. Sterling studied Blackwood for a long moment, reading the conviction in the younger man's eyes. You're putting your credibility on the line for her. No, sir, Blackwood corrected. I'm putting the truth on paper. She put her life on the line for us. The least I can do is make sure her record reflects what actually happened. Sterling picked up his pen and signed the amended report. Agreed. I'll forward this to SOCOM with a recommendation for immediate recognition. At minimum, she's earned an Army Commendation Medal with Valor Device. More likely, we're looking at a Silver Star. He paused. For what it's worth, Captain, what you just did, admitting you were wrong, giving credit to a subordinate who saved your life, that's the mark of a real leader. Blackwood simply nodded, not trusting his voice. Dismissed, Sterling said. Get some rest, and send Specialist Thorne to see me when medical clears her for duty. I want to shake her hand. Blackwood saluted with his good arm and walked out into the fading light of late afternoon. The base medical facility was a series of climate-controlled tents connected by covered walkways, smelling of antiseptic and the particular sterility of military medicine. Hallie lay on a cot in the recovery area, her left leg elevated and wrapped in compression bandages, an IV drip feeding fluids and antibiotics into her system. She had refused the morphine they offered, accepting only ibuprofen for the pain. Dulled senses were a liability she would not accept, even here in relative safety. She was not asleep, though her eyes were closed. She was running through the mission in her head, analyzing each shot, each decision, looking for mistakes. It was what she always did after an engagement. The time to celebrate was later, if ever. The time to learn was now. She heard boots on the concrete floor, the distinctive rhythm of someone walking with purpose. She opened her eyes. Captain Blackwood stood at the foot of her cot, his arm in its sling, looking down at her with an expression she could not quite read. It was not the dismissive irritation from their first meeting, nor the desperate gratitude of a man being rescued. It was something more complex, more human. "Specialist Thorne," he said formally, "how are you feeling?" "Like I fell down a mountain, sir," she replied, the ghost of dark humor in her voice. "That's because you did." Blackwood pulled up a metal folding chair and sat, a gesture of equality that was unusual given the rank difference. "I just came from Colonel Sterling's office. I amended the after-action report to reflect your actual contribution to the mission's success." Hallie's expression did not change. "That wasn't necessary, sir." "It was absolutely necessary," Blackwood countered. "What happened out there needs to be documented accurately, not for publicity, not for politics, but because when the next junior operator questions a senior leader's plan, that leader needs to remember what happened when I didn't listen to you." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his voice dropping to something more private. "You were right. I should have listened. I'm not apologizing to make myself feel better. I'm acknowledging that I was professionally negligent. I let my biases override good tactical analysis, and I nearly got my entire team killed because of it." Hallie watched him carefully. She had heard apologies before, had heard plenty of men say sorry when what they really meant was, "Please don't file a complaint." But Blackwood's body language was open, vulnerable in a way that military officers rarely allowed themselves to be in front of enlisted personnel. "By regulation, I disobeyed a direct order in a combat zone," she said quietly. "That's grounds for court-martial." "By regulation, yes," Blackwood agreed. "But by the law of battlefield necessity, you made the correct tactical decision. You saw what I couldn't see, and you acted on it despite the personal and professional consequences." He straightened slightly. "I'm logging it as initiative in the absence of reliable communications. The radios were compromised by the storm. You couldn't receive clear orders, so you executed your best tactical judgment. That's exactly what we train operators to do." The corners of Hallie's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but the foundation of one. "You're bending the truth pretty hard there, sir. I'm interpreting events in the most favorable light, which is my prerogative as mission commander," Blackwood replied. "The truth is that you saved 7 lives, and you deserve recognition for that, not punishment." He stood, preparing to leave, but paused. "I learned something today, Thorne. I learned that I've been measuring people by the wrong metrics. Size, strength, background. None of it matters if the fundamentals are missing. And you have the fundamentals: tactical awareness, technical skill, physical courage, and the willingness to stand alone when you know you're right." "Thank you, sir," Hallie said and meant it. Blackwood nodded and walked away, his boots echoing on the concrete. Hallie lay back on the cot, staring at the canvas ceiling of the tent. Something had shifted today, something fundamental. She had spent 4 years trying to prove she belonged, trying to earn respect that always seemed just out of reach. Today, she had stopped trying to prove anything. She had simply done her job at a level of excellence that made proof unnecessary. The dining facility at Forward Operating Base Sentinel was a long tent with industrial air conditioning units bolted to the sides, fighting a losing battle against the heat. Inside, long tables made of plywood and sawhorses were arranged in neat rows, and the smell of institutional food hung in the air, a mix of overcooked meat, powdered potatoes, and coffee that had been sitting on a burner too long. It was 1800 hours, the dinner rush, when 300 soldiers cycled through to refuel before night operations began. The room buzzed with conversation, the particular brand of military humor that was 50% gallows comedy and 50% coping mechanism. Hallie entered through the side door, moving slowly, her left leg stiff and painful, despite the compression wrap and the ibuprofen. She had declined the crutches the medic offered, accepting only a knee brace that provided some stability. Walking hurt, but being carried hurt worse, in ways that had nothing to do with physical pain. She wore a clean uniform, the first in 2 days, and had taken the time to shower despite the logistics of keeping her bandaged leg dry. Her hair was still damp, slicked back tight against her skull. The cut on her cheek had been closed with butterfly bandages, a thin line that would probably scar. She moved through the food line, accepting portions of whatever was being served without really looking at it. Chicken, rice, vegetables that had been cooked to the point of structural failure. She grabbed a carton of milk and a small salad, the kind of meal that was about sustenance rather than enjoyment. The dining facility was crowded, every table occupied by clusters of soldiers in various states of exhaustion and cleanliness. Hallie scanned the room, looking for an empty corner, a place where she could eat quickly and disappear before anyone decided to ask questions or offer congratulations she did not want. She found a small table in the far corner, near the exit, with her back to the wall. Old habits. She sat down carefully, extending her injured legs straight out to minimize the pressure on the bruised tissue, and began to pick at her food without appetite. She was 3 bites into her meal when the doors at the main entrance opened and Viper team walked in. They moved as a unit, still carrying themselves with the particular swagger of Tier 1 operators, despite the bandages and the visible exhaustion. Kruger was in the lead, his massive frame drawing eyes from every direction. Behind him came Brennan, Hicks, and the others, all of them cleaned up but still bearing the marks of the day's violence. Captain Blackwood was last, his arm in its sling, moving more carefully than the others, but refusing to show weakness. Normally, Viper team commanded the large center table, the prime real estate where they could spread out and hold court. Hallie watched them move toward it, expecting them to take their usual positions. She kept her head down, focusing on her food, trying to become invisible through sheer force of will. But they did not stop at the center table. Kruger's eyes swept the room and locked onto Hallie's corner position. He changed direction, walking directly toward her table. The others followed without question, trusting his navigation. Hallie looked up, confusion evident on her face, as Kruger stopped directly opposite her. He was holding a plastic tray loaded with enough food for 2 people, his expression neutral, but his eyes communicating something that might have been respect. He did not ask permission. He simply pulled out the metal folding chair and sat down, the chair groaning under his weight. His large frame seemed to overflow the small space, but he made no move to crowd her. Then came Brennan, pulling up a chair on her left. Then Hicks. Then the others, dragging chairs from nearby tables with loud scraping sounds that drew the attention of the entire dining facility. They surrounded her table, not to intimidate but to fortify, creating a perimeter of operators that sent a clear message to everyone watching. She is one of us. The room's volume dipped noticeably as 300 pairs of eyes turned to watch this unprecedented display. In the rigid hierarchy of military dining facilities, where rank and unit cohesion dictated seating arrangements, this was a public declaration of acceptance that screamed louder than any ceremony could. Blackwood was last to sit, taking the seat directly across from Hallie. His good hand unwrapped his silverware with deliberate care. He did not make a speech. He did not explain. He simply looked at her, nodded once, and began to eat. Kruger opened a carton of milk, took a sip, and then pushed the salt shaker across the table toward Hallie. "Pass the salt, doll." The nickname hung in the air for a moment, and Hallie understood instinctively that this was the test. The word could still be an insult, could still carry the weight of dismissal. Or it could be something else, a call sign, a term of endearment earned through shared trauma and mutual respect. The context made all the difference. Hallie picked up the salt shaker and slid it across to Kruger, her eyes meeting his. Here. Kruger's beard shifted in what might have been a smile. He salted his food with exaggerated care, then looked back at her. That was some shooting today, Thorne. Best I've ever seen, and I've worked with some legends. Just doing my job, Hallie replied, the same deflection she always used. No, Brennan interjected from her left. You did our job. You kept us alive when we made stupid choices. There's a difference. Hicks, the younger SEAL with the recruiting poster jawline, leaned forward. How long did it take you to climb that mountain? That cliff face is rated as a technical climb, even with proper gear. You did it in a storm, in full kit, with that cannon on your back. 40 minutes, Hallie said quietly. Give or take. 40 minutes, Hicks repeated, shaking his head in disbelief. I couldn't do that climb in 40 hours. You could, Hallie replied. If the alternative was watching your team die, motivation is a powerful thing. The conversation flowed naturally after that, the team discussing the mission with the kind of analytical detachment that came from years of turning violence into data. They dissected tactics, argued about alternative approaches, debated whether the haboo had helped or hindered the enemy's ambush. It was the language of professionals, and Hallie spoke it fluently. She noticed something else happening as they talked. Other soldiers in the dining facility were watching, listening. Word had already spread through the base about what had happened, the details growing more exaggerated with each retelling. But seeing Viper Team, the most elite unit on base, treating this small woman as an equal, that carried more weight than any story. At one point, a young female soldier approached the table hesitantly. She was maybe 22, wearing the uniform of a combat engineer, her name tape reading Reeves. She stopped a respectful distance away, uncertain whether to interrupt. Brennan noticed her first. Can we help you, Private? Reeves looked at Hallie, her eyes wide with something that might have been admiration or might have been desperate hope. Ma'am, I just wanted to say thank you. Hallie looked up confused. For what? I don't know you. You don't have to know me, Reeves said, her voice gaining strength. What you did today matters. It matters to all of us who are trying to prove we belong here. Hallie set down her fork, considering her response carefully. I'm not an officer, so don't call me ma'am. And I didn't do it for you. I didn't do it to make a statement. I did it because my team was in danger, and I had the skills to help. The bluntness of the statement might have crushed someone else, but Reeves just nodded, understanding the deeper message. Competence first, identity second. But, Hallie continued, her voice softening just slightly, I'm glad if it helps. Just remember that you don't owe anyone an explanation for being here. You just owe them your best work. Do that, and the rest takes care of itself. Reeves nodded again, this time with a smile, and returned to her table. The meal continued. The conversation shifted from tactical analysis to the kind of crude humor that soldiers use to cope with trauma. Kruger told a story about a deployment in Afghanistan that was probably 30% truth and 70% embellishment. Hicks countered with a tale about a training exercise gone wrong that had everyone laughing despite themselves. Hallie found herself relaxing in a way she rarely did. The constant tension of being evaluated, of being judged, of needing to prove herself easing just slightly. She was still alert, still observing, but for the first time in recent memory, she did not feel like an outsider looking in. As the meal wound down and soldiers began clearing their trays, Blackwood leaned back in his chair, regarding Hallie with thoughtful attention. Question for you, Thorne, he said. When you were up on that ridge, when you realized we were walking into the ambush, did you ever consider just letting us learn the hard way? The table went quiet. It was a bold question, the kind that could only be asked by someone secure enough to contemplate their own failures. Hallie considered the question seriously, not deflecting with humor or false modesty. No, sir, The thought never crossed my mind. You were wrong about the tactics, but you weren't wrong about everything. You're a good leader who made one bad call. That doesn't mean you deserve to die for it. Even after we treated you like shit? Kruger asked bluntly. Even then, Hallie confirmed. Being a professional means doing your job, regardless of how you're treated. If I only saved people who were nice to me, I'd be in the wrong line of work. Blackwood nodded slowly, absorbing this. That's a level of discipline I'm not sure I could match. That's the difference between ego and duty, Hallie said simply. Ego wants vindication. Duty just wants the mission to succeed. The simplicity of the statement landed with unexpected weight. These were men who had spent their careers in a culture that valorized toughness, aggression, dominance. The idea that true strength might look like humility was a perspective many of them had never fully considered. The sun was setting outside, painting the sky in shades of purple and burnt orange that filtered through the canvas walls of the dining facility. Soldiers began filtering out to prepare for night operations, the room gradually emptying. Viper teams stood as a unit, collecting their trays. Blackwood lingered for a moment, looking down at Hallie. Get some rest, specialist. We've got a follow-up operation in 72 hours. I want you in the briefing, and this time, I want you presenting the terrain analysis. Your call on the approach route. It was not an apology. It was something better. It was trust. Yes, sir, Hallie replied. The team filed out, leaving Hallie alone at the table. She looked around the now quiet dining facility, at the sunset light streaming through the entrance, at the empty chairs that had been filled with men who had finally seen past her height and her gender to recognize her competence. She thought about the long road that had brought her here, the thousands of small humiliations, the constant need to be twice as good to be considered half as competent. She thought about all the times she had wanted to quit, and she thought about today, about the climb and the shots and the slide down the mountain, about the moment when Kruger had called her doll, and it had sounded like respect. The journey was not over. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new doubters, new mountains to climb. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, Hallie Thorne felt like she had finally reached a summit worth the climb. She stood, collected her tray, and walked out into the cooling evening air. Her shadow stretched long across the ground in the fading light. At 4 feet 9 inches, she was still the smallest person on this base, but in the failing light, her silhouette was indistinguishable from the giants she walked among. 3 months later, Forward Operating Base Sentinel bustled with the controlled chaos of a shift change. A new SEAL team was arriving to rotate in as Viper team prepared to rotate out. The incoming unit, Team Sidewinder, was fresh from their pre-deployment workup, all sharp edges and untested confidence. Their team leader, Lieutenant Marcus Hendricks, was 28 years old and looked like he had been assembled in a laboratory designed to create recruiting posters. Square jaw, broad shoulders, the kind of natural athleticism that made physical training look effortless. He had graduated top of his class at Coronado, had distinguished himself in 2 previous deployments, and carried himself with the unearned certainty of someone who had never truly failed at anything important. He walked across the tarmac with his team sergeant, a 40-year-old combat veteran named Weaver, who had seen enough wars to know that the young always thought they were invincible, right up until the moment they learned otherwise. "So this is Sentinel," Hendricks said, surveying the base with the critical eye of someone looking for flaws. "Doesn't look like much. Where's the team we're replacing?" "Viper team rotated to rear area yesterday," Weaver replied, checking his roster. "But their sniper attachment is still here. Extended deployment for specialized training." "Their sniper?" Hendricks asked. "Any good?" "I don't know much," Weaver admitted. "Just that she's been here for 6 months, and Viper team requested she stay on for the transition." Hendricks stopped walking. "She? They attached a female sniper to a SEAL team?" "Apparently," Weaver said, his tone carefully neutral. Hendricks shook his head, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Great. Another diversity checkbox. Bet she spent the last 6 months making coffee while the real operators did the work. Weaver did not respond immediately. He had learned over 20 years in the teams that the loudest voices were rarely the most informed. They continued across the base toward the equipment bay. As they approached, Weaver noticed a small figure working at a cleaning station set up outside the bay. A woman, barely 5 feet tall, was field stripping a massive rifle with the kind of practiced efficiency that came from thousands of repetitions. Hendricks saw her at the same time. His smirk widened. "Well, look at that," he said loud enough to carry. "They gave the armorer a doll to play with. That rifle's bigger than she is." His team, hearing their new commander's joke, chuckled dutifully. Weaver, however, had noticed something that Hendricks had not. The rifle was a Chi-Tak M200 intervention, one of the most sophisticated long-range precision systems in the military inventory, and she was handling it with casual familiarity. Weaver also noticed the name tape on her uniform. Thorn. His stomach dropped. "Lieutenant," Weaver said quietly, urgently, "we should keep moving." But Hendricks was already approaching, his stride confident. "Hey there, sweetheart. You lost? This area is for combat personnel only." Hallie Thorne looked up from her work. Her face was impassive, her eyes hidden behind ballistic sunglasses that reflected Hendricks's smirking face back at him. She did not respond immediately, instead using a bore brush to clean a section of the rifle's chamber with deliberate care. "Lieutenant Hendricks," Weaver said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Stop talking. Right now." Hendricks glanced back at his team sergeant, confused by the sudden urgency. "What? I'm just—" "You're making a mistake," Weaver interrupted. He stepped forward, positioning himself between Hendricks and Hallie. "Sir, this is Specialist Hallie Thorne. 3 months ago, Viper Team walked into an ambush in the Devil's Throat Canyon during a Class 5 haboo. They were pinned down, blind, taking casualties. Specialist Thorne climbed Hill 3050 solo in the storm, established overwatch at 3050 meters, and eliminated 9 hostiles with 9 shots. She saved every single member of that team." The smirk died on Hendricks' face. His expression shifted rapidly through confusion, disbelief, and dawning realization. "9 kills at 3000 meters? Hendricks said, his voice dropping. "In a sandstorm?" "9 for 9, Weaver confirmed. "The after-action report has been sent to SOCOM as a case study. Captain Blackwood put her in for a Silver Star. She's now the go-to consultant for long-range precision fire training for the entire theater." Hendricks looked back at Hallie, who had resumed cleaning her rifle, apparently unconcerned with the conversation happening 10 feet away. The confidence that had carried him across the tarmac evaporated. He approached again, this time with his ego firmly in check. "Specialist Thorne," Hallie looked up. "I apologize for my comments," Hendricks said, and to his credit, he sounded genuine. "That was unprofessional." Hallie regarded him for a long moment. Finally, she set down the bore brush and stood, her full height barely bringing her eye level to his chest. "Apology noted, Lieutenant," she said, her voice neutral. "But unnecessary. I've heard worse from better men." The casual brutality of the statement landed like a physical blow. Hendricks absorbed it, nodded, and tried to salvage the situation. "I understand you're on Overwatch for our operation next week. I was hoping we could get your tactical assessment before we step off." It was a request, not an order. It was an acknowledgement of her value as an operator. "That depends, Lieutenant," she said, a ghost of something that might have been humor crossing her face. "You planning to listen this time?" Hendricks blinked, then realized she had been listening to the entire conversation, aware of every word, choosing when to respond and when to ignore. "Yes, ma'am," Hendricks said seriously. "Every word." Hallie nodded. "Good. Briefing is at 1900 hours in the TOC. Don't be late. The terrain in this theater doesn't forgive poor planning." She turned back to her rifle. The conversation was over. Hendricks and his team walked away, properly chastened. Weaver fell into step beside his lieutenant, saying nothing, letting the lesson sink in. "I'm an idiot," Hendricks muttered. "You're young," Weaver corrected, "but you learn fast." Behind them, Hallie Thorne finished reassembling her ShyTac. She ran a function check, the bolt sliding smoothly, the trigger breaking cleanly. Satisfied, she began loading magazines for the next operation, each round seated with careful precision. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and violet. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new doubters, new people who would see her height before they saw her skills. But tonight she had work to do, briefing to prepare, terrain to study, operations to plan. The work never ended. But that was fine. The work was what she lived for. She walked toward the operations center, the ShyTac slung across her back, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove. They called her Thorne now, and when they said it, they meant precision. They meant excellence. They meant the woman who climbed impossible mountains and made impossible shots, because the alternative was watching her brothers die. Hallie Thorne, 4 feet 9 inches of pure, undiluted competence.